Welcome to Meditate to Create with Saskia and Terry Clancy. This is episode 2. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. I'm really excited about this one because this is where we delve into Terry's 38 years working with people who had mental and physical disabilities at a psychiatric hospital in Brisbane. Terry is a self-help author and narrative meditation practitioner. We'll touch, I think, a little bit on narrative meditation today in this episode, but what we really want to delve into, if Terry allows us, is these 38 years in a psychiatric hospital. Wollston Park, it was called.
Wollston Park, yes.
Outskirts of Brisbane. So you did 3 years nursing apprenticeship. How old were you at that time when you started?
I was 21.
21.
Yes.
And what was your perception at 21, if you can cast your mind back to that first day walking into Wollston Park Psychiatric Hospital?
14th of January.
Oh, and how were you feeling on that day?
Very apprehensive, yes, very apprehensive. Yes, it was a different reality. It was the psychiatric hospital was a different reality. Yeah, there were these old buildings, some going back to early 1910, 1920s. Old buildings, beautiful grounds. Had beautiful grounds on the banks of the Brisbane River, because psychiatric hospitals were built on water, access to water, because there was a law back in the 19th century that lunatics couldn't be transported on the King's highways. They had to be transported on water.
I thought there was going to be some, because water calms you situation going
on. No.
No, that was not the case?
No.
How many patients were in Wollston Park on the 14th of January 1974 when you began?
There were 2,000.
2,000. Okay, so 2,000 patients. You walk in, 21 years old, on the 14th of January 1974, first day of your mental health nursing. Is that what would it have been called, your mental health nursing?
Well, it was psychiatric nurse, actually. You did your psychiatric nursing training, not mental health nurse. Okay. That changed in the 90s. You were a psychiatric nurse.
Oh, we didn't really call it mental health in those.
No.
Were you scared of the patients?
No. There were a lot of strange-looking people, yes. Wandering around the place.
Strange-looking how, exactly?
Oh, well, they were strange-looking people, yes, who had been institutionalised for a very long time. And the hospital was their home. It's the only place they knew. And they were would be wandering around, interacting with people, yes. So it was a very strange place, very strange environment to come into. We did shifts, shift works, yes. It was 6 to 2 shifts, 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. shifts, and 10 p.m. till 6 a.m. So it was 8-hour shift. And you were paid, the meal breaks were included, right? So you were paid just for 8 hours for being there. So it was highly regulated, union-controlled environment, actually. Yeah, so all your workplace conditions were very tightly controlled by the unions and management. Yeah. So it was a very structured place. Very structured. There was a framework. That was the framework of how the whole place was managed.
And Terry did change that framework down the track. But in those beginning, I think let's work on those first 3 years. What were some of the real, I suppose, highlights, and what were some of the real, this is quite full on.
Yeah, right. So you're a 20-year-old coming into a psychiatric hospital, and of course you had to do your apprenticeship. And of course, you were put into the worst situations.
So what would a worse situation be between 1974 and 1977 in a psychiatric hospital of 2,000 patients? What, off the top of your head, in those first 3 years, would have been the most difficult situations for you?
Oh, well, the first 6 months you were put into the infirmary, part of your training. So the infirmary was for people who were had chronic mental illness, predominantly schizophrenia, and who were probably dying. Yes, they were dying. Who'd been in the institutionalised for a very long time, and the infirmary was where people went to be cared for until they passed on. That was your first 6 months.
So what does the infirmary look like? If you could paint us a picture, is it a big room? Is it lots of small rooms? What sort of interaction did you have
There
with
were
the patients?
old buildings built in the 1920s, 1930s. There were all beds along the walls. There were no private possessions. There was no area for private possessions at all. Yes, so it was, and verandas. Patients were cared for on verandas. There was no air conditioning, of course. And so it was a pretty basic sort of environment. Yeah. So student nurses were put in as you were the workforce, looking after people. But I enjoyed it, actually. I enjoyed looking after the people. Yeah.
So, as a student nurse looking after people, what was sort of on the checklist of what you needed to do in a day to look after, or in your 8-hour shift? What did that look like from a care perspective?
Basic needs. It was just looking after basic needs. We're not into self-actualisation or anything like that. It was looking after basic needs. Patients were hydrated, had been fed, were clean, making sure everything was fine. Carbalising the beds, making the beds. Admission beds was part of your training, making an admission bed. Carbalising was the old term of, disinfecting everything. That was your job. To have a clean environment, very much Florence Nightingale sort of thing, had a clean environment. And I enjoyed it. Yeah, I enjoyed doing that, making people comfortable. Yeah, so I took pride in that.
Did you find that the other nurses in the infirmary in those beginning months were the same as you and enjoyed it, or was there generally some that didn't enjoy it?
Oh yeah, some didn't enjoy it. No. So you did your first 6 months of your training was in the infirmary. Then you were put into the male forensic wards.
Male forensic wards. Okay, what does that mean?
There were 2 wards. They're called Osler House and Pierce House, which were named in the Burdekin inquiry as the worst wards in Australia. So your next 6 months you were a student nurse in these wards for people, males and females, who had chronic mental illnesses, dominantly schizophrenia, who had a history of violence and treatment-resistant illnesses.
When you say treatment-resistant illnesses, would that also be mental health related? And at the time there was no treatment, or is this a separate?
The illnesses hadn't responded to the treatments that were available. Yeah, so the medications that were available at the time, which were the older generation of medications. Yeah, it was about getting the right balance of things, that people didn't have the side effects from the medications, and there were a lot of side effects from the medications. Yeah.
What sort of side effects at the time would you have seen frequently in the patients?
Well, sedation is a side effect. Yeah. At the time, there were what they called extrapyramidal side effects. So there were nervous system side effects. So people would have ocular gyric crises, people would have arching of the backs, spasms, shaking, tremors, salivation. These were all the extrapyramidal side effects of the old medication. So people would have arching of the back. Their backs would go into spasms. Where the eyes would go into the back of their would go backwards, so they couldn't see, of course.
I can picture it very clearly in my head. So this was...
So your job was managing these side effects too. So it was monitoring the side effects. Blood pressure side effects, of course.
Were there times where the side effects would become dangerous in terms of... would people die from the side effects in this environment quite frequently, or not so frequently, but it would occur?
Well, seizures were a side effect as well. So people would have epileptic seizures because the drugs lowered the epileptic threshold. So people were more likely to have epileptic seizures under the older medications, and they were used up until the 90s. They were phased out. And they used antidepressants for tricyclic antidepressants, which also had side effects, lots of side effects.
So at the time when you, in these early years, what was believed to cause, so you say the majority of the patients were schizophrenic patients.
Yes.
At the time in the 70s, what was believed was the cause of schizophrenia, or what was schizophrenia? Was there really an understanding of it at the time, or was it sort of, we don't really know, we'll medicate?
Well, it was genetic, yeah. It was seen to be, believed to be genetic, plus environment. So there was genetic factors, then environmental factors such as particular stresses that people were subjected to in their lives. They were compounded the illness. So there was past trauma, of course, in people's lives. So it was interacting, but predominantly the view was that mental illness was genetic. And of course that's changing now. Yes.
That was the belief.
Different frameworks of practice. There was predominantly at the time was custodial care. You just looked after the basic needs and community integration. No, it was something that didn't happen. It wasn't part of the plan.
Okay, so you had your 3 years as a nursing apprentice.
Mm-hmm.
And from what you're saying, it sounds like you were a little bit of a different nurse, where you really enjoyed caring for the basic needs of the patients, but there was a little bit more to it for you. Did you feel that in comparison with your colleagues at the time, that you felt that there was a little bit more that you could do for these psychiatric patients?
Oh, yeah. There was a lot more we could do, right? Yes, I felt that. And I felt that the care that they were receiving wasn't good. Could be a lot better. It was like, there was a book called Asylums by Irving Goffman back in the 60s, yes. It was about psychiatric hospitals and the culture of the psychiatric hospitals. And it was very true description at the time. It was very true that there was differences, there were barriers between the staff and the patients. It was the culture. So you didn't form relationships. You didn't, there was not empathy and compassion. No. It was about control. So the culture was about control. It was an authoritarian, hierarchical structure, about control of large numbers of people who were very unwell. That was the times, yes. That was the times, and the times were changing.
Love the Bob Dylan reference.
That's a good line.
How good.
That's a good line.
So this obviously, you changed the way that this was run at Walston Park. What was the catalyst, the first little catalyst in this change at Walston Park. You eventually became the nursing director, but what were the first little changes that Terry Clancy made in really making a big impact on these psychiatric patients at the time?
Well, I enjoyed connecting with the patients. I enjoyed connecting with them. They didn't experience this connection really routinely. It wasn't part of the culture to actually connect with patients. I know that sounds weird, but it wasn't part of the culture. You had to maintain a separateness. You didn't connect, really. And because that was a sign of weakness, and that would break down the authoritarian structure, and you would be forced into anarchy and chaos. But of course, it was very bureaucratic, and everything was had rules and regulations about everything. But of course, no one actually got rehabilitated, or no one actually got discharged.
Yes, which is something that we touched on earlier. So at the time, did you think, well, shit, this is... I want to help these people become rehabilitated and discharged.
Yeah, that's the idea, yes.
And how... So how did this begin? You had to go a little bit back to your hippie days and do some protests, or was it a slow process that you brought in to the facility?
Oh, well, there are other ways of being, that's right. There are other ways of how we can do things, how the art of practice of how you do things, yes. So I was developing, understanding the frameworks. Understanding the framework of how the system works, see. So how did the authoritarian asylum work? Then how did the medical model? So it changed to a medical model of treating problems, then changed to a rehabilitation model framework. So how do you work in these different frameworks? Yes. So it's understanding. You've got to understand the frameworks and how the system works. Yeah.
You've got to know the rules, and then you can break them.
Yeah. Because it's a bit of a powder keg. Health services are a bit of a powder keg of, you've got different disciplines, you've got different laws and regulations, codes of practice that are the framework of how you work. And you have a duty of care, of course. And the standards and laws are changing, evolving, and community expectations are changing. You've got to adapt. You've got to adapt as you grow in your practice.
So by the late 70s, were you then working as a night nurse? When did you start working? So you obviously finished your training. Did you then go straight into night nursing, or did that come later?
Oh, no, you had to do your time. So you had to do, I think it was 3 months a year. You had to do 3 months a year, night shift. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And that's when the journey begins. Okay, so in those beginning years, there are obviously some key experiences for you that then made you really want to change the system, but to really rehabilitate. What were some of those key experiences for you?
It was connecting with particular people, yes. Connecting with particular patients, yes. Who I'm still connected with, actually.
So are these then, I'm assuming, patients that were rehabilitated?
Yes.
Okay. So did you start slowly talking to them and being more connected with certain patients? How did this journey begin and changing?
It's about all those things, about empathy, understanding their problems and where they're at, showing compassion, of course, but it's also developing a connection. Developing a connection, in mental health nursing, it's a therapeutic alliance. You develop the therapeutic alliance with patients. So how do you do that? How do you develop this therapeutic alliance of connection? Through goals, through health goals.
And this is how the narrative meditation began. So did you see, there were obviously certain patients that you did connect with, and did you then, through communicating and connecting with them, realize that there were some health goals that these patients had, and there were obviously a handful that you felt you could really connect with?
Yes.
And did this sort of happen organically, that you thought, okay, well, you might have some goals, let's chat about it, because you hadn't established narrative meditation yet.
No.
This is the beginning of narrative meditation. So in your head at the time, how did that sort of come about?
It's your framework of your practice. So it's how you practice. So under the custodial model or medical model, so the treatment team would come up with a plan, right? Would come up with a plan. They wouldn't discuss the plan with the patients. It wasn't discussed with the patients. You raise your eyebrows. Yes. So there was the plan, the treatment plan.
So they just decided this is what.
So the clinical team, psychiatrist was head of the clinical team, would decide this is the treatment plan, which was written up.
And was this mostly medical?
Yes, medical.
Know, this is what, pretty much.
So yes, so it was levels of observation. There were medications ordered. There were any restrictions on care. What ground access people had, whether people were entitled to leave, etc. And there were medical orders about observation of any side effects or any observations or how side effects were to be managed for particular people. So it was that was the treatment plan under a medical model. And of course the patient was the recipient of the treatment plan. It wasn't about rehabilitation. No. That was evidence-based practice at the time. Yes.
So how did you manipulate that treatment plan to include goals and a goal eventually of rehabilitation or entering back into society?
Yes. Yes. So under the custodial model and medical model, there was a hierarchy. You know, the patients are at the bottom of the hierarchy, of course. So there was a hierarchy of control, and that was the bureaucracy, and that was the way things were done. Yes, that was the framework of practice. But there was no method of connection.
So how did you change that, the method of connection? How did you bring that in?
Involving patients in their care, in their own treatment, yes. This is the beginning of the narrative.
Can you remember the first patient?
So things began to change in the 90s, actually. Where patients actually recognised as human beings.
So before then, so now you started in 74, we're really fast tracking 16 years before 1990. What was it in the 80s? Was it sort of business as usual with the patients sitting at the bottom of the hierarchy for that entire decade?
Yes, and that's the way it had to be, so or else you had anarchy and chaos.
Okay, so in that entire, my God, 16 years, the first 16 years.
There was anarchy and chaos.
Yeah. For those first 16 years, did you sort of stay within your lane and just, do what you could do?
Yes, you had to. You had to fit in with the culture.
You had to fit in with the culture. And then at a time in the early 90s, we'll assume, you'll tell us the date, you connected with the first patient that you thought, okay, we could have a method of connection here, some goal setting, a narrative meditation was born. So tell us a little bit about that first patient.
Oh, I remember him, Michael, yes. He had very complex needs.
What do you mean complex needs?
Oh, well, physical needs, psychiatric needs, social needs, been isolated from his family for 20 years, had no contact with family. He had one arm. He fell under a train in Sydney, lost his arm. He had HIV, which at the time in the 90s was a pretty serious sort of condition to have. He had been incarcerated. He had a history of armed robbery, so he had a forensic history.
Okay.
So it was pretty complex, and drug use, of course, which probably caused his schizophrenia. So he had chronic schizophrenia with auditory hallucinations.
Oh.
And he was violent, very violent man. He would go and attack people in response to his auditory hallucinations. So I became his primary nurse.
How old was he at the time? Do you remember?
He would have been 45, yes.
And how long had he been in Wollston Park at the time that you became his primary nurse?
10 years.
Tell us about your story. What happened with Michael?
I learnt a lot from Michael. He'd studied Egyptian mythology in prison, when he was in prison. He knew everything about Egyptian mythology, and he'd tell me about it, you see, as a schizophrenic interpretation. I thought he was fascinating. So he developed this alliance, this connection. Yes. We'd talk about the things and his spiritual beliefs, that he believed that when he died, he became a star in heaven, you see, like a pharaoh. He was going to become a star in heaven. I thought it was very good. That was his belief, and he believed it. He had a phantom arm.
It's quite common, right? Yeah.
But his phantom arm connected him to the centre of the universe.
Oh, okay, so not so
That's
common.
where all the voices were coming from.
Okay.
All the voices were coming from there. And he couldn't take the antipsychotic medications.
Why?
Because of his HIV.
Oh, okay. So did you find that he then was more, sounds very un-PC, but more openly crazy than a lot of the highly medicated patients at the time?
Oh, yes. So it was my job to take on people with complex care needs. So Michael was very complex care. Yes, very complex. So we developed a therapeutic alliance of working on his goals.
Okay, what does that
health
mean?
goals.
Therapeutic alliance? His team or you and him?
Just me and him, yes. Connection, developing a connection.
Okay. So he obviously needed to trust you in order to form this therapeutic alliance. How long did that take for him to trust you?
We worked together for 5 years. Yeah. Eventually tracked down his family in Victoria. And I took him to visit his mother in the rural areas of Tasmania. Yes, which was interesting. All the family were Collingwood supporters, which was interesting.
So you had
yes.
quite an alliance. Would you say a friendship with this man?
It was friendship, yes. He came to me when he had problems, issues. He had quite a few.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So in those 5 years together, did you start the goal setting, that would become the narrative meditation practice? Was he sort of your first patient that you developed this method of meditation with, would you say?
Well, there were many patients, yes. It was working with him, working on his goals, developing his awareness.
So what were those goals? Do you recall what his goals were?
Oh, yeah. It was to be independent. He wanted to be independent as possible, and working in partnership with him, it was for him to be as independent as possible and manage his physical problems and his mental state and his symptoms. So he was having auditory hallucinations. They were accusatory voices saying all sorts of nasty things to him about his sexuality, etc., which he didn't like, and he would then think he had no awareness of the voices. He thought it was other people talking to him.
Okay.
Then he'd go and attack them.
Did you then, one of the goals, did you get him to see that they were voices and they weren't people?
Yeah. It was about his illness, talking to him about his illness that he actually had, and that the voices weren't actually coming from real people. They were just hallucinations. They were things popping up in his head, and how to manage it.
So that's the awareness, obviously.
Developing awareness, yes.
Okay, so Michael was the first of many where we essentially, now looking back, you started your narrative meditation, your meditate to create with Michael, but you went from, I suppose it is 16 years, but you went from learning nursing in a psychiatric institution, a psychiatric hospital.
Best place to learn.
To be
Best.
to looking after the most complex cases in the hospital.
Yes.
How did this happen?
It was my job.
But you're obviously very good at your job, Terry, to go from...
Yeah. It's like if you get good at something, you get given more work to do, actually. So looking after people with complex care needs, physical, emotional, psychiatric, social, it becomes your job.
Michael, then you started communicating with him, realizing that if a complex case like Michael's, and the other 35 complex cases that you were working with at the time had goals that would help with their rehabilitation. And how did that sort of idea come into your mind?
Oh, well, it's a holistic framework. So you develop a holistic framework, what is physical needs, social needs, spiritual needs, of a person.
But did you develop these holistic frameworks?
Oh, I've been around for a long time, but it's how to apply it in your own practice. What does it mean? What do all these things mean? So you need a framework. You need a holistic framework to develop goals of your practice. Yeah.
But in Wollstone Park in the 1980s, in the 1970s,
there was no holistic framework.
There was no holistic framework.
No.
Did you introduce this holistic framework, or did that naturally happen in the early 90s?
It was evolving over time, it was evolving. There used to be separate, what they called nursing care plans, which was separate from the treatment plan, the medical treatment plan. There was a nursing care plan. They were evolving. There were different methods of doing that, how you actually put it together. So it was evolving. So actually treatment became integrated with rehabilitation using a holistic framework. Yes, so it became integrated.
So I know you're quite modest, but do you believe that the holistic framework at Walston Park was introduced by you at the time?
I participated, yes. I participated as it's all about working in partnership with many people over many years. It eventually became my responsibility, yes, to implement it, develop it, and implement it.
As nursing director?
Yes, I was a clinical nurse consultant for rehabilitation for 20 years, you see. Then I became nursing director. It was my responsibility to implement care planning, rehabilitation.
How fantastic. How fantastic.
It was a great opportunity.
A big clap here. Yeah. So rehabilitation, when you began, and the first 16 years of practicing wasn't really on the cards, let's say. But from the early 90s in psychiatric hospitals worldwide, but obviously for you in Walston Park, rehabilitation became something that I suppose the patients could see, okay,
oh yeah,
I can be rehabilitated.
Yes.
And were stories like Michael's, should we go back to Michael's story and see how Michael's ends? So Michael was obviously violent. He hadn't seen his family. You then said you took him to see his family. So
yes.
he was let out, essentially, in order to go and see his family, right?
Yes, he hadn't seen his mother for 15 years, I think. Yes. And I stayed with them for a few days and visiting the relatives, and because Michael had, because of his legal problems, become very estranged from his family, and he developed his illness. So it was very good for him to have a connection again with his family. It was good. One night he became distressed and he moved away, he got out, away, and I followed him. I said, well, what's the problem? He said, oh, he saw his mother develop these huge angelic wings. I said, oh, really? This is when you're out in the rural areas. So he was having hallucinations.
Was there any way at the time to stop the hallucinations, or was that just something that they had to accept? Again, being aware, okay, this is something that happens. Was the point sort of the first step awareness that this is your life?
Yes, developing awareness of these things. It's part of the illness. It's part of the illness. It's objectifying things. That's the illness. It's not you. It's part of the symptoms of the illness. It's what we can do to manage it through your goals. We can manage your illness to decrease your stress in all the little different areas of dimensions of your life. So how do you manage your physical issues, problems, your psychiatric problems? How do you manage them? How do you look after your health, like to decrease your stress, which could exacerbate your symptoms, you see? So it's a holistic approach, developing your goals, and that becomes your care plan.
Michael was discharged. He went to see his family, and what happened? What happened to Michael?
It was developing his care plan. So I worked with him and lots of other people of developing their care plan. So the model was working in partnership. It wasn't a separate...
With him?
With him, yes. It was working in partnership. How was he managing his symptoms? How was he his physical health issues and safety for himself and other people? And managing his psychiatric symptoms when he was stressed or when he had these hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, what he could do to manage it was to recognise, to be aware, just to be aware that they were auditory hallucinations and how he could manage it. By he could come and talk to me about the problems he was having, or talk to a nurse and perhaps get a PRN medication if they were really disturbing him. Yes. So it was how to manage his symptoms. It was the care plan. And it wasn't just managing problems. It was, it was he needed to recreation. What was he enjoy going to the movies? you know, socialising. So, yes, so I was developing a care plan, a holistic care plan to manage his illness, and taking control of things like his finances, so he could manage his own money, etc.
So was this when he was discharged, that care plan, or was this while he was still...
So that becomes part of the discharge plan, yeah.
Okay.
So the care plan.
He was discharged. Do you remember the year that he was discharged?
It was 1998.
Okay. So you'd formed quite a relationship with him by this stage. He was discharged. You went with him to see his family, or was that before he was discharged?
It was before he was discharged.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he was discharged, and then what happened?
Oh, well, the social worker found a very good place for him in St Kilda, where people with Michael's problems were looked after in a group home situation, and things like, so everything was, he had a disability, chronic illness, he had disabilities, so the group home looked after things for him, which was very good, and there was... so the plan of care was transferred over to the group home and to the local mental health services. So that was successful. About a year later, his mother rang me to say he died, yes.
How did he die?
He stopped taking his medications. But there is another twist to the story, actually. So I'm watching Four Corners, and he pops up on Four Corners. He was interviewed on Four Corners. All the problems of the homelessness, or the mentally ill and the homelessness. He was interviewed on Four Corners. So I'm having my cocoa, looking at... almost choked. He was on Four Corners, yeah.
Was that obviously when he was in St Kilda?
No, he'd taken himself back to Sydney. He'd taken himself. So all continuity of care had broken down. His antiviral medications, he wasn't taking them. His psychiatric medications, he wasn't taking them.
So did he die? Did his HIV then develop into AIDS? Would you say he died of AIDS? Yeah. Okay. How did that make you feel? As of course, your care plan got him discharged. In my opinion, it's still a much better life than staying. But did you feel some guilt towards his death, or were you still really happy and fulfilled that you were part of his rehabilitation?
Bit of both. Really, you do your best. You practice what you think is in the best interests of the person, developing a care plan, yes, or based on what he wants to do, and keeping the treatment team happy, the family happy about things. In the end, you think, well, and he as a person was happy. He was a free spirit. He wanted to enjoy his life as much as he could. Yes, it's true. But where do you draw the line? Do you control people's lives to that extent? This is the dilemma, of course, and it still is. So we have problems. Today we have problems. How far do you control, people? But okay, you've got responsibilities. As they say, there are responsibilities. You've got an illness to manage your illness, but a lot of people don't. And they need that outside control to help them manage their illness.
So part of helping them manage the illness was the forming of narrative meditation. How did your experience in mental health nursing, and obviously with people like Michael, lead you to develop narrative meditation as we see it today?
Well, Michael's actually part of the meditation groups. Yes. I took meditation groups as part of rehabilitation for about 10 years.
Was this voluntary at the time
Oh, yeah.
for the patients?
Oh, yeah. It was called stress reduction, groups. And I'd learnt a method of meditation, you see, on goals. Yes. So I would coach it to patients in the facility, off and on for over 10 years. And Michael was part of the group. So we developed this connection, yes. It was very interesting, yeah. Because he would talk non-stop through the meditation. But eventually he would stop.
We do want to delve a little bit deeper into your case studies of your mental health patients and how this really essentially helped them to be rehabilitated. Would you say that? Would you be able to be confident enough to say my narrative meditation?
That's right.
It's
about connection. It's about connection. And narrative meditation, yes. What is the... it's a method. Yes, it's a process of developing the self-awareness, and it's an outcome of a deeper level of meditation. Yeah.
If we were going to be modest, as Terry Clancy is modest, how many people in your 38 years of being a psychiatric nurse at a psychiatric hospital do you believe changed their lives through your method of narrative meditation?
Well, it's complex. Yes. When you're trying to identify causes, okay, there are whole heaps of other changes happening at time. Things are pretty dynamic. So the meditation groups, yes, were very, very powerful, really. As I said, at the time, this is the 90s, there was no awareness in medicine of neuroplasticity. Science, medicine believed at the time the neurons you were born with is the ones you had and decreased as you aged. That was the...
You couldn't change your brain, essentially.
You couldn't change. There was no rewiring thing.
Which now we know is absolute shit, and you can totally do it.
Yes. So how that was connected with rehabilitation wasn't understood by senior psychiatrists. And I worked with very senior psychiatrists. Yeah.
So how did you then know, okay, there's another way? You started meditation groups. And did more and more people sort of join the groups, or was it a little bit...
The open groups, yeah.
And how did you start this idea of these narrative meditation groups?
Well, I was learning meditation myself, you see. Yeah. I'd been to the relaxation centre in 1977 and I learned a method. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is 13, 20... Wait, my maths. 15 years before you're practicing this in your meditation groups. So in those 15 years from when you started, were you practicing on your own throughout and developing your own?
Off and on.
And was the goal at the time to develop this meditation practice to help these psychiatric patients, or were you doing it for yourself and it just happened to align with your professional career?
It was intuitively known that stress reduction helped alleviate the symptoms of psychiatric illness. It was intuitively known, stress reduction. Yeah, not the reasons why it helped rehabilitation and recovery. There was no understanding of that. There was no understanding of neuroplasticity, the brain changes, structure and functioning. There was no understanding of meditation as a method of rehabilitation. There was no understanding of that.
No science-based evidence.
So evidence-based practice was use of medications, not meditation as a method of healing. There was no understanding of it at all. And till the 90s, till the year 2000, really.
It's actually crazy that it's so recent.
And it's really changed in the last 10 years, yes.
Well, because now, as far as I understand, they've scanned brains and they've seen what happens when people are in a meditative state in their science-based
They can
evidence.
actually see it.
They can actually see it, right?
Actually
so
see
not
it.
the effects of it, they can actually
Little
see it
lights
in the
going
brain.
on. Yeah. Gosh.
We're slowly unpeeling the layers of the onion here
Yes.
into the narrative meditation. What's in the middle of an onion? A cake.
Getting towards the centre.
The center of narrative meditation. So in our next episode, we're really going to delve a little bit deeper into narrative meditation, how Terry Clancy formed this unique type of meditation, and what Terry did in retirement, and how the narrative meditation is alive today after all your experience in the psychiatric hospital. Can't wait. So stay tuned. Meditate to create with Saskia, Terry Clancy.
Thanks, Saskia. Very nice. Very good. Yes.